Hey guys, my name is Emma Tuttle, and today we are going to talk about using light creatively in portrait photography. Now, a little backstory here. When I first got started in photography, I really wanted to learn how to use the camera, obviously. I wanted to learn how to get a blurry background with the little circles, the bokeh, but then I also realized that light was key. That lighting made a huge difference between whether the photo looked good or not. Today we're going to talk about 3 lighting techniques: backlighting, silhouettes, and what I call highlighting, but I don't actually know the real phrase for it. Now I'm going to add a quick caveat before we get started. It's very important that you know how to shoot in manual for the specific styles that we are talking about, because you have to be able to completely control what you're getting to get the right exposure. Auto might work for you, it might make a good guess, same for aperture priority, but it seems to me to be a lot easier if you shoot in manual. So I could be wrong, but it will probably be best for you for the sake of these techniques if you knew how to do that. So the first lighting technique I want to talk about is backlighting. This is a tried and true favorite of mine. I love it so much. What does it mean? It simply means that you put your light source behind your subject. And it creates this really fun light wrapping kind of technique where it softens what you're looking at. There's not the harsh light happening, and it kind of wraps around your subject. I don't know why it works that way. I don't know how it works that way, but I do know that it works, and it's like universally flattering for all people. It's the kind of look that you see when you see a photo and someone has like a rim of sunshine around their hair. That's called backlighting. You can also do it when you don't see that sunshine. It can just be them on like a totally blown out background, and it still kind of has that same glowy effect. It just looks a little different than if you had a solid background behind them. To me, backlighting is one of those techniques that can make it look very professional in a photo when you take a portrait. When you do auto mode, it doesn't really understand what you want to expose for. And typically when you're backlighting, your background might be a lot brighter than your subject, and so you would have to boost your exposure for your subject. And so when you are a professional and you can adjust the settings on your camera, or also on an iPhone, you can normally bop it, drag the exposure up. I don't know the Android equivalent, but you can normally adjust it a little bit. But typically, to me, it looks like a really professional kind of lighting, and it is used by so many photographers because of that. What's really cool about backlighting is that it can really separate your subject from the background if you have a darker background behind them. So it can kind of like outline them while also making them look nice and illuminated and bright, and still adding that separation with that background. So you have a contrasty, dynamic kind of photo. Something really fun you can do with backlighting is control the amount of light that you're bringing in front of your subject. So if you have enough light coming in, whether it's through the trees or just with a plain exposed sky, you can move yourself or your subject a little bit. So then you might bring in a little bit of lens flare, and then it completely obscures your subject, which can be a really artistic, fun technique to use. Or you can move so that they're completely crispy clear and in focus. Now, sometimes you might find that you have too much light coming into your photo and you can't really control it. Maybe the sun is above your subject's head, and so you can't use them to block out the sun. Maybe you tried to get really low, but it didn't let you get low enough for their head to block out the sun. And so in those cases, I might use my hand to block the light, or I would find, if possible, a shadow to stand in myself so that I am completely in shade, but they're still in the sun, and then that will get rid of that additional light spilling in that you don't want. So the second technique I want to talk about today is silhouettes. So for those of you that don't know, a silhouette is when you have someone who is normally completely dark, completely black, and then it is exposed for the sky behind them. So this works really good on evenings when you have a really killer sunset and you want to show off that sunset, but maybe you've wrapped up your shoot and want to add something a little bit more interesting to the end of your photo session. And so I love to add silhouettes for that reason. Personally, they're not my favorite. I don't do them all the time, but if I can, I add them in because they can be very interesting. The main thing with silhouettes is that you do expose for the sky, and oftentimes waiting as long as possible for that sunset to really develop completely pays off, which means you might need to be a little bit more patient while you're waiting for the light to change, but you're gonna get the best sunset possible behind your subject. Now, unlike with backlighting or highlighting, I think that posing is very, very important when it comes to silhouettes. Because for example, if someone is facing straight on towards a camera, you're just gonna kind of see the outline of their body, but you're not gonna understand like what the shape of their face is. Do they have arms? Like, are we seeing the shape of things on their body? And so it's important that you create shapes when you make a silhouette, as well as exposing for that epic sunset behind them. If you're posing with a group of people during a silhouette, I typically try to make all of them have a different pose, so it's just more interesting. I also encourage them to put their chin directly over their shoulder because you're going to get the purest profile possible because they're about 90 degrees away from the camera as opposed to facing the camera straight on. I also try to get as low as possible so I can show as much of the sky as I can. In an ideal world, you would be on top of a hill where you wouldn't have to get low and the sky would just be completely open to you. But most of the time I have to get nice and low so that the sky is bigger behind my subject and I don't have much of that completely dark ground at the bottom. However, if there is something interesting happening on the bottom of the photo, like maybe there's really cool flowers or something, that could be a cool thing to incorporate into the foreground when you get nice and low, but it's also gonna have the sky in the background. So remember, silhouettes are about playing with shapes and being patient and waiting for that sunset to develop. Now, the last technique that I want to talk about, I call highlighting. And to me, that means that you're kind of combining silhouettes with also sort of backlighting, and that you're gonna have like rim lighting happening. It's kind of hard to explain, so it's better to show in photos, but basically you are working with shapes, you are working with light, and you are working with extreme exposure differences within one photo. So in backlighting, we're exposing for the person. In silhouettes, we're exposing for the background. And then in this highlighting technique, you are exposing for one thing, but you are using your exposure to shape your composition in a really unique way. So for example, I might have a bride who's standing in a shaft of light and she is completely illuminated and it's showing these details of her. Normally I'd have them stand to the side, kind of like in a silhouette, so we're showing the side detail because the light is only going to be hitting them from the side. But then there might be something else in the photo that is properly exposed, like a window, for example. So we're gonna show that window in one part of the frame, and we're gonna show our bride in another part of the frame. And it's going to make for something kind of artistic and kind of interesting. And you're gonna have these really dark shadows in the meantime. Typically with those, you're not gonna see a lot of detail, but it makes for this overall kind of moody composition that is achieved without a filter. It's just achieved with knowing how to use your camera and using composition and lighting to the best ability that you can. It can also take some trial and error, but when you get it right, it's so satisfying. And so it's something I definitely encourage you to play with if you haven't done it yet, even if it's just as a creative exercise to try to figure out how to do something new and differently. The one thing I want to say about this is it's normally easier to do in the winter and the fall when the sun is lower in the sky. When the sun is higher, you're gonna have harsher shadows coming down on your subject, and the side light that you get in the fall and winter for longer periods of the day makes it more possible throughout the day, and it's more flattering. Something you also wanna look out for when you're using this technique is not to overexpose the face of the person you're working with. It can be really easy because the shadows are so dark to think that you've made your photo dark enough, but probably you haven't. So make sure that when you expose for the photo, you can properly see all the details of the person because they do have this harsh direct light coming on them. And if it is overexposed, you're gonna lose one of the most important components of your image. So that wraps it up, guys. I'm sure if you've been in photography for a while, you're familiar with these techniques, but if you're new, I would love to know how you have incorporated them or if you have any questions about how to make it work. Figuring out the right exposure, how to use your light, how to shape your light can really make a big difference in what your final photos look like. And so I hope that you use this to the best of your ability, that it helps you grow in your photography journey, and that you just have fun with everything along the way. And remember always to like, comment, and subscribe if you have any questions and if you like what you see here.